So today we're going to be talking about how to pass the CCIE Routing and Switching Written Part 1, Strategy and Planning. And this is based on my recent experience and pass of the CCIE Routing and Switching Written. So let's get into it. This is going to be a multi-part series. Right now it looks like 6. I've already written a little outline. It may change. There may be a separate costs part. I'm not sure if that's going to be its own or a separate, but basically part 1 is this one: introduction, strategy, planning, right? How to get started, where to get started, etc. Also, part 2 is learning to learn. You'll see why that's like at the beginning. And these 2 parts are at the beginning. You can't just jump into the lab. There's some other things we got to look at first, right? What materials to use? Be part 3. What materials should I use? Part 4 is going to be specifically about the evolving technologies section, which crosses boundaries in the CCIE, multiple disciplines, as well as the CCDE. And so I'm going to kind of part that out as its own thing. Then 5, mistakes to avoid, which is something I can speak to based on having failed it twice, passing the 3rd time. I'm going to share my mistakes, and hopefully that will help you out. And then part 6 is executing the plan, just kind of a wrap up. But yeah, let's talk first about introduction or strategy and planning, I should say. And before I get into that, actually, there are a few caveats or disclaimers, whatever you want to call it. This is my experience, right? Basically, I'm going to relate how it went for me, what I thought worked, what I thought didn't work. But in the end, you own it. You own your own destiny. You own your own pass, right? And journey to passing this exam and in the future, the lab exam. So my strategy may be, my experiences may provide no value to you, but I think they will, at least in some parts, sharing the experience with someone, and you can pick and choose which parts may or may not be helpful to you. Also, this is, as soon as this goes up on YouTube, it'll probably be out of date. So this in particular had to do with version 5.1 of the CCIE Routing and Switching and Evolving Technologies version 1.1. Also, I had a score of 806, so it's not like I got 1,000. I was happy with an 806, trust me. Actually, on the 3rd attempt, I did not think I had passed. So it actually came as a little bit of a surprise that it popped up. That is a passing score, is barely a passing score. 804 is a passing score. One of my study buddies passed with 804. He was happy, and I was happy for him, right? The other thing is, some bloggers, etc., will wait until they've actually passed the lab before they do a series like this. And I can see a lot of merit in that. I plan to do another series about the lab once I pass that. And so just keep that in mind. I have not yet attempted the lab, but I do know quite a bit about the lab in terms of talking to other people. I've taken the Cisco Live Walk-in Self-Paced Lab, so I've gotten a taste of what it's like, right? So also in my work experience, so, I'm about to tell you about my journey, but my work experience with some of these protocols is little or none. Some of them I've worked with more than others, and that's going to factor into which strategy I chose, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Also, I'm not a spring chicken anymore, so I'm not 20 years old. Memory and memorization, I think, as you get older, is more of a challenge. So keep that in mind when you think about my strategy. I'm in my 40s, so keep that when you think about my strategy and the methods that I selected. But let's talk about strategies. So there are generally 2 methods. You've probably heard about this before. Basically, pick your poison, right? And we are talking about first-timers taking the written exam. We're not talking about people who are doing a retake because they have their CCIE and they're wanting to renew their credentials, their certification. So this section in particular, some of these sections are going to be geared towards first-timers. Now, there are people who have asked me, knowing that I recently passed, I'd love to get some feedback on materials and things like that. I'm getting ready for a retake. So I will have sections of the videos for those, and if that's the case, you may want to skip to part 3 or part 4, or even part 5, if you're just concerned about information for a retake, right, or for a recertification. But if you are a first timer, you don't have your CCIE yet, and you have not yet passed the CCIE routing and switching written exam, then you have a choice to make. Let's just suppose you're essentially starting out scratch, or you're restarting. Some people are in that scenario too, where several friends who they started it up and then they let time or some other factors of life got in the way. They could not possibly keep studying at the time, and now they're coming back to it. You might say sort of starting anew, and that's fine. Either way, you need to pick your poison. What is your approach? And the two generally used that you hear about are, one is prepare for the written, worry about the lab later. So that is essentially treating the written as its own entity. Of course, we all know that, there's crossover between what is required in the written blueprint, or what is, topics that are in the written blueprint, and that there's a lot of, information on the written that will also be important in the topics for the lab blueprint. So we all know that, but so there's a decision to make, right? And some say, well, I'm going to treat the written as its own thing and worry about the lab later. The other approach is to prepare for the lab. In other words, prepare to pass that CCIE lab, learn the topologies, learn the technologies, learn the protocols for the lab blueprint, and learn them well to the point where you're reasonably confident that you're prepared to do a lab exam. And at that point, you circle back to the written and cover the written topics that are not in the lab. And, there are advantages and disadvantages to each. I'm going to explain to you what I chose to do and why, and kind of give you my advice on either or, right? And my advice will depend, right? And principally the factor for me is your experience level. So if you are working at a job where you use BGP every day, and you already know a lot of the ins and outs of BGP or a lot of the other protocols that are covered in the lab exam, then maybe it's best for you to take approach number one, is just to prepare for the written. I actually chose the second strategy to start because of a lack of work experience in a number of these protocols. So experience is always the best teacher, right? So I decided, well, this was the reasons for doing so, and that is because once you pass the written exam, a clock starts, and that clock is, it expires. And if you don't pass the lab exam in a timely fashion, you could end up having to go back and take the written again in order to continue as a candidate who can actually book the lab exam. Because as you know, you cannot even go online and book the lab exam until you have proof that you've passed the written. And the thing is, I believe I have these correct here. There's some math here, but essentially once you pass the written exam, a clock starts and you have 18 months to attempt the lab exam. If you do not attempt the lab exam in 18 months, let's say month 19, you decide to schedule and book the lab exam. Well, your written exam has expired, so you have to go take it again. The other thing that could happen is, let's say you take the lab exam in 12 months from the time taking your written, but you fail. That's okay. You've got a clock that sort of restarts. And then the clock you're worried about, I could be oversimplifying this, but I think that what happens is you can reattempt the lab at that point within the constraints of how often you can take the lab until the 3 years is up. And then you would have to go back and take the written exam again. So that's why if you have already a lot of experience with these protocols and you use them at the CLI on a daily basis, then, I would say it might be beneficial for you to just go ahead and attack that written exam, because the written, despite that there is a lot of crossover of topics, it is a different beast in and of itself, in my opinion. And from what others I've seen, other CCIEs have even commented about recently on some of the blogs that have been written, that the written is hard and it covers a lot of different topics that have nothing to do with what you will see in the lab exam. So it merits it's sort of its own attack plan, right? So that's why in my case, without having a lot of that experience, I decided I was going to lab as much as I could, get relatively confident in labbing a lot of the protocols, then go back to the written. We'll see that my journey turned out a little differently, but that is what my advice to you would depend on. Biggest thing is evaluate yourself against the blueprints themselves. So I actually have on my, down below, there's a link to my GitHub account. There's a notes repo where I have a copy of both blueprints in the same Excel spreadsheet, and all the different areas are highlighted. In other words, items that are unique to the written exam, like ISIS, are highlighted and color-coded in a different color. So you can actually look at those blueprints and compare. Or you can go online and find them, Google them, or on Cisco's site. The other thing you could do is just seek advice of a mentor who hopefully is a CCIE, has passed both the written and the lab, and that knows you and knows your level of, where you're at. And if you have someone like that, that's great. Then, ask them what they think, and take that into account. Also, there are a number of courses that I'm going to mention later on in the materials part of this series. And in some of those materials, they actually start out, most courses, CCIE, vendor courses, they start out with advice on this very topic. So, get advice from several different sources and just see which way you want to go, which strategy. Either way, though, I'm going to emphasize this throughout the series. Let the blueprint be your guide, right? Use it to assess yourself honestly and take a good hard look at it, without self-serving bias. Look at those blueprints and figure out where am I at and make an honest assessment and evaluation, right? The other thing I'll mention is about planning. So we talked about strategy, choose a strategy. I tell you, that is that's probably the most important first decision that you're going to make. It should be the first decision you're going to make. Some people I've seen sort of start out somewhat haphazardly. They're just kind of experimenting, and that's fine. Everybody has a different style. But I would say start out by selecting, choose your poison, right? Pick your path. Are you going to fork to the left? Or are you going to fork to the right? And go from there. Then once you know your strategy, start your planning. And I sort of I started out treating it like a project, like a long-term sort of project, sort of the waterfall style. And, like any big project, you're going to be expected as a CCIE. That's one of the things. Even if you interview later or are hired later at a job where you don't even use multicast or BGP, which is unlikely, but let's say you don't even use layer 2 technologies. One thing that the CCIE, in my opinion, one thing that it carries with it is a lot of credibility in terms of professionalism. Someone who has learned how to study a topic thoroughly and has learned how to prepare, and who, in my view, they're very likely that they can manage a project, right? Implement a project from beginning to end, plan it out, scope it out, do the design, do the budgeting, communicate appropriately. And I just treat this CCIE as a project, really, in and of itself, a life project. It's on my bucket list. So, but with any long-term project or important project, you have to calculate or attempt to calculate kind of what the commitment is in terms of your time and your energy and your cost. Budget it out. How much is it going to cost? Take the time to do that. Don't just dive into reading the official certification guide, right? Take your time up front, like we said, for the strategy, for the planning, And don't sell yourself short on this particular phase of your CCIE accomplishment, right? And communications, of course. And this, of course, goes in general. This is a sort of like a starting out, really, video in a lot of ways, but in particular towards the written, communicate with all the important people in your life, at your job, and most importantly, your family. Get your support system, mentors, your professional network, your personal network, and just communicate out, kind of what's going on, get agreement, get commitments, and you have to do that with any project if it's going to be successful, right? And of course, budget your time, budget your money. I'll have some specific budgeting tips probably in a later version of this series. But then once you have your sort of plan in place, plan your work your plan. This applies to the written and the lab, of course. And now this last part of this introductory video, I'm just going to talk about my particular experience. My original plan was to do the second option, which is to lab. Then when reasonably ready to attempt a lab, I would circle back and attack the written. That's not how it happened. What I started out doing was I'm going to talk about some of these steps, later on, but I started out reading books cover to cover. I read a number of books, and I read a number of chapters of particular books just to sort of get started. And that was one of the recommendations in the I&E materials. So anyway, I started doing that, and, I've heard a number of different recommendations, but I thought to myself, I'm going to study for the lab exam. And I started going through, after doing some reading, I started going through the I&E workbook. And I got pretty far. And my idea was that, once I get completely through the I&E workbook, actually, before doing a lot of the advanced labs, I would just lab all the protocols and then go back and study for the written material, book my written date, take the exam. Then after passing the written exam, I would come and do advanced lab preparations, like foundations labs, possibly get, Narvik's workbook, etc. And then schedule and take the lab exam. Well, here's what happened. I'm going to talk about this more in the My Mistakes video. But what happened was I got more than halfway through the I&E workbook, and for the first time in my career, I had an opportunity to go to, I've had opportunities before, but for the first time I attended Cisco Live. And with Cisco Live, they give you a free exam as part of, depending on your package, of course. But I had an opportunity to take a free exam. I was like, okay, cool. You know what? I should circle back now, take advantage of that free exam, hopefully pass. It's $450. And up until now, most of the materials that I've had to purchase for my I&E journey have been out of my own pocket. So this was one that, the company was paying for me to go to Cisco Live. I was going to get a free take, quote unquote free, and, hopefully I would pass. And then I could just continue on and blitz, finish the I&E workbook all the way through, and then just go directly to the lab. That's not what happened. So, in other words, I found out, I think in February of last year, that I was going to be able to go to Cisco Live. So from February till June, I circled back and just started studying for the written. And I'm going to talk about why I think that, not that taking the written was a mistake, but why my approach doing that was a mistake. I'll go into that in a little more detail. But that's what I attempted, and the unfortunate thing is I did not pass in June. So then I had an option. I had the option to, after failing, okay, well, I'm going to go back to my original plan. It was great. I got that experience. I'm going to go back to my original plan, finish labbing these technologies, and then I'll go back and take the written again. kind of like what I was going to do in the first place. You just take this as a bonus. I did not do that. I don't know. I reacted, I guess, a little bit emotionally. I decided to schedule a retake of the written for like 5 weeks later. And I cowboyed it, and I was not ready. And it took the second fail to tell me, you know, you're trying to go too fast. Slow down. You got to learn these protocols that are covered in the written exam better, and let's do a right and proper job. And so from like July through December, about 5-6 months, I studied for the written, and I went through an actual course for the written from beginning to end, and I passed it January the 2nd of this year. So I planned to take it in December, but I scheduled like December 31st, and they allowed me to schedule for that date. Then they came back and said, no, we're rescheduling you for the 2nd. So that was my strategy. That's actually how it came about for me to pass the written. And stay tuned for next week, where we're going to talk about beyond the strategy and the planning, to me, the second most important thing to focus on, and that is learning to learn, honing in on your own learning strategy, right? So we'll talk about that in the next video of the series. You can follow me here on this channel. Feel free to subscribe. We'd love it. And I post how-to videos on here. And of course, I also upload on a daily basis my Twitch streams. You can follow me on twitch.tv/TheLandTamer, where I stream daily for the most part. And you can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for stopping by. Stay tuned for part 2 coming soon.